Johnny Carson had interviewed James Stewart dozens of times over the years. Jimmy, as everyone called him, was a frequent guest. Beloved. Reliable. The kind of guest who made the show feel effortless. He'd tell stories about Hollywood's golden age, share anecdotes about his films, charm the audience with his signature drawl and ah shucks demeanor. America loved James Stewart. And Johnny Carson loved having him on the show. But that night in 1981 was different. James Stewart was 73 years old. Still sharp. Still gracious. Still the gentleman everyone expected. He'd arrived at NBC's Burbank studio that afternoon just like he always did, early, prepared, courteous to every crew member. The producers had a list of talking points, his latest film, stories from his career, maybe a funny anecdote about his co-stars. Standard stuff. Easy territory. Nobody knew what James Stewart was carrying. The show started normally. Johnny did his monologue. The audience laughed. A musical guest performed. Then came the moment. Ed McMahon's voice boomed through the studio. And now, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. James Stewart. The audience erupted. James walked onto the stage with that familiar gait. Tall, slightly stooped, endearingly awkward. Johnny met him halfway, shook his hand warmly, and they both sat down. The interview began exactly as planned. Light. Fun. Comfortable. Jimmy, it's always great to have you here, Johnny said, that signature Carson smile in place. Well, Johnny, it's always a pleasure, James replied in that distinctive voice that had defined American cinema for decades. They talked about his recent projects. Laughed about old Hollywood stories. The audience was enjoying every moment. This was the James Stewart they knew. The James Stewart they loved. Safe. Familiar. Comforting. Then, about 10 minutes into the segment, Johnny asked a question he'd asked variations of 100 times before. A throwaway question. The kind meant to transition to a commercial break. Jimmy, after all these years in this business, what keeps you going? What still matters to you? James Stewart paused. Just for a second. But Johnny noticed. After 30 years of interviewing people, Johnny Carson could read silence. And something in that pause felt different. James looked down at his hands. Folded them carefully. When he looked back up at Johnny, his eyes had changed. You know, Johnny, James said slowly, there's something I've never talked about publicly. Something I've carried for 22 years. The studio went quiet. Not the manufactured quiet of a dramatic pause. The organic quiet of people sensing something real was about to happen. Johnny leaned forward slightly. His professional instincts kicked in, but so did something else. Genuine concern. Jimmy, you don't have to. I want to, James interrupted gently. I think I need to. Carson stopped mid-monologue. The entire studio froze. Johnny set down his note cards. Gestured subtly to the band. Doc Severinsen, who'd been ready to start the commercial break music, held still. The cameras kept rolling, but everyone knew this wasn't scripted. This was something else. In 1969, James began, his voice steady but different now, quieter. My stepson Ron was serving in Vietnam. Marine Corps. He was 24 years old. Good kid. Strong. Believed in what he was doing. The audience was completely silent. You could hear the ambient hum of the studio equipment. Nothing else. We got letters from him. Regular. He'd write about his unit, about the people he served with. Never complained. Never showed fear. That was Ron. Tough. Dependable. James's voice cracked slightly on the last word. He cleared his throat. Johnny didn't interrupt. Didn't try to fill the space. Just waited. On May 8, 1969, James continued, Ron's patrol was ambushed. He was killed instantly. He was leading his men. Doing his duty. Being the Marine they trained him to be. Several audience members gasped softly. James nodded, acknowledging their reaction. We buried him. Full military honors. The flag. The rifle salute. Everything a fallen Marine deserves. And then we went back to our lives. Because that's what you do. You carry on. You don't burden other people with your grief. James looked directly at Johnny now. For 22 years, I haven't talked about Ron publicly. Not in interviews. Not at events. I kept that separate. Private. Because it felt like if I talked about it, I'd be using his death. Exploiting it somehow. And Ron deserved better than that. Johnny's eyes were glistening. He didn't try to hide it. Jimmy, I'm so sorry. Thank you, Johnny. James took a shaky breath. But here's the thing I've learned. The thing I wish I'd understood sooner. Silence doesn't honor the dead. It buries them twice. Ron lived. He mattered. And by not talking about him, I wasn't protecting his memory. I was erasing it. Backstage, he made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. Johnny stood up. Not dramatically. Just quietly stood, walked around his desk, and sat in the chair next to James. Not the host chair. The guest chair. Level with him. Present with him. Tell me about Ron, Johnny said softly. Not the Marine. The person. Who was he? And James did. For the next 15 minutes, The Tonight Show became something it had never been before. James Stewart talked about his stepson. About the kid who loved baseball and couldn't carry a tune. Who was terrible at math but could fix any engine. Who wrote poetry he never showed anyone. Who was afraid of spiders but volunteered for the most dangerous assignments in Vietnam. Johnny listened. Asked questions? Real questions. Not interview questions. Human questions. The kind you ask when you actually want to know someone. The producers in the control room were panicking. They were way over time. Sponsors were waiting. The schedule was blown. But Johnny had his earpiece out. He'd made his choice. The audience sat in complete stillness. People were crying openly. Strangers held hands. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was witness. This was a father finally able to grieve publicly for a son he'd lost 22 years ago. At one point, James reached into his jacket pocket. Pulled out a small, worn photograph. Handed it to Johnny. This is Ron. This was taken a week before he deployed. Johnny looked at the photograph. A young man in Marine dress blues. Smiling. Confident. Alive. Johnny's hand trembled slightly as he held it. He looks like a good man, Jimmy. He was the best of us, James said, his voice finally breaking completely. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Johnny handed the photograph back carefully. Reverently. Like it was sacred. Because it was. Then he did something that broke every rule of television hosting. He reached over and took James Stewart's hand. Just held it. 2 men. 2 fathers. One living. One carrying the weight of loss. The cameras captured it all. The crew, professionals who'd filmed thousands of shows, were crying behind their equipment. Ed McMahon, usually ready with a quip or a laugh, sat silently off camera, tears streaming down his face. When James finally composed himself enough to continue, he looked directly into the camera. If you've lost someone in service to this country, I want you to know something. Your grief is not a burden. Your loss is not private. These men and women lived. They mattered. And we honor them not by staying silent but by saying their names. By telling their stories. By making sure they're not forgotten. He turned back to Johnny. I'm sorry it took me 22 years to understand that. Johnny shook his head. You understood it, Jimmy. You just needed the right moment to say it. The show didn't return to its normal format. There was no comedy bit to lighten the mood. No transition to something easier. Johnny simply turned to the camera and said, We're going to take a break. When we come back, actually, I don't know what we're going to do when we come back. But we'll figure it out together. During the commercial, James and Johnny sat together. Didn't speak. Just sat. The audience remained quiet. Respectful. Understanding that something profound had just happened. When the cameras came back, Johnny was at his desk. James was still in the guest chair. Before we end tonight, Johnny said, I want to say something. This show has been on the air for a long time. We've had incredible guests. Historic moments. But what just happened here, what Jimmy shared with us, that's different. That's important. And I'm grateful. We're all grateful. The audience stood. Not applauding. Just standing. A silent acknowledgement. James Stewart nodded, accepting their witness. Then he stood, shook Johnny's hand, and walked off stage. Not to music. Not to applause. Just to silence. Respectful, reverent silence. But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home, ever saw coming. After James left, Johnny didn't introduce the next segment. Didn't make a joke. He just sat at his desk for a moment, collected himself, and said, Ronald McLean. That was his name. Ron. James Stewart's stepson. Killed in action May 8, 1969. 24 years old. United States Marine Corps. I wanted to make sure you heard his name. I wanted to make sure he wasn't forgotten. Then Johnny reached under his desk. Pulled out a small note card. Wrote something on it. Set it prominently on the corner of his desk where it would be visible for the rest of the show. The cameras zoomed in briefly. On the card, in Johnny's handwriting, Ronald McLean 1945 to 1969 USMC. This stays here, Johnny said to the camera, for the rest of tonight's show. As a reminder that while we're here making jokes and having fun, there are families who paid prices we can't imagine. And the least we can do is remember. The show continued. But it was different. Quieter. More thoughtful. The comedy segments felt gentler. The audience laughed but differently. Like they were grateful for the levity but mindful of the weight. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. The next day, the network received thousands of calls. Letters poured in. From Gold Star families. From veterans. From people who'd lost loved ones and had never felt permission to grieve publicly. They thanked James Stewart for his courage. They thanked Johnny Carson for holding space for that grief. James Stewart never hid Ron's memory again. In subsequent interviews, he spoke about his stepson openly. Proudly. He became an advocate for Gold Star families, using his platform to ensure that the sacrifice of service members wasn't forgotten. Johnny kept that note card. For the rest of his time hosting The Tonight Show, on Memorial Day and Veterans Day, he'd place it on his desk. Never explained it on air. Never drew attention to it. Just a quiet acknowledgement. A promise kept. Years later, when Johnny Carson retired, he gave that note card to the Smithsonian. It sits now in the American History Museum. A small piece of paper with a name and dates. Ronald McLean. 1945 to 1969, USMC. A reminder that television, at its best, isn't just entertainment. It's witness. It's memory. It's making sure that the people we've lost aren't forgotten. James Stewart passed away in 1997. At his funeral, among the tributes to his legendary career, the most prominent photograph wasn't from a film. It was that picture of Ron in his marine dress blues. The one he'd shown Johnny Carson that night. Because in the end, James Stewart's greatest role wasn't in It's a Wonderful Life or Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. It was being a father who loved his son enough to finally let the world know he existed. And Johnny Carson, the master of comedy and timing, proved that the most important thing a host can do isn't make people laugh. It's know when to stop trying. When to sit beside someone. When to hold their hand. When to make sure a name gets spoken out loud so it echoes into history instead of disappearing into silence. States Marine Corps. Killed in action serving his country. Son. Brother. Marine. Remembered. James Stewart carried that grief for 22 years in silence. Johnny Carson gave him permission to carry it out loud. And in doing so, they both honored the truth that grief shared is grief survived. That name spoken our lives preserved. That the bravest thing you can do on television isn't perform. It's witness. The note card stayed on Johnny's desk every Memorial Day until he retired. A promise. A memorial. Proof that one conversation could change how a nation remembers its fallen.